This is Liberty Law Talk, part of Liberty Fund's online library of law and liberty. Your host is Liberty Fund Fellow Richard Reinsch. Our web address is libertylawsite.org, where you can subscribe, comment, find other episodes and links related to today's conversation. Our email address is lal@libertyfund.org. Today we are discussing with Professor Roger Scruton his latest book, How to Be a Conservative. Roger Scruton is a graduate of Jesus College, Cambridge. He has been a professor of aesthetics at Birkbeck College, London, and a university professor at Boston University. He is currently visiting professor of philosophy at Oxford and a senior fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center in Washington. I won't even attempt to list the large number of books that he has authored over the years. I will note that he writes regularly for The Times, The Telegraph, The Spectator, and he was the wine critic for many years for The New Statesman. Roger, it is wonderful to have you on the program and to discuss this new book, How to Be a Conservative.
Thanks very much for inviting me.
So a number of years ago, decades ago, Friedrich Hayek wrote a famous essay entitled Why I Am Not a Conservative. And he made the claim that conservatism was intellectually hollow. It had no content, no substance, no real program. In short, that conservatives don't really know what they're about or really what they should do. Was he right in that assessment?
Well, he was right about some conservatives, obviously. In fact, most people, whether on the left or on the right, don't really know what they think or what they're doing or why. But he was wrong in general. I think that what he was greatly influenced by the emerging post-war consensus, the 50s and the 60s in Britain and elsewhere in Europe too, which saw the alternative to socialism not as a completely different conception of human society, but as a kind of softer form of socialism, still adopting the managerial approach to the state and still thinking that all social matters, all social problems were really the responsibility of the state. And I think and he saw the British Conservative Party in particular swallowing that idea.
So you think
he turned against.
So you think he's largely reacting to the conservative governments in the United Kingdom in the post-war era?
Yeah, I think he was, yes, and he was disappointed, of course. What he didn't realize sufficiently was that there was, and still is, an intellectual tradition of conservatism, including people like Edmund Burke, which is very close to his own forms of reasoning, in particular his sense of the common law as a form of collective rationality, which emerges over time. That is a totally conservative thesis and fundamental to what Burke is defending in his famous essay on the French Revolution.
Now, of course, conservatism is incredibly articulate in America, also in the United Kingdom in other ways. Your book, How to Be a Conservative, is arguing, and I think the purpose you say that you've set for yourself in the book is how to show the reader what conservatism should aspire to do now in a late modern liberal democracy in the West. What exactly is that? How does one be conservative in a time that is incredibly untraditional, non-conforming, doesn't understand there to be really any substance about our countries, our societies, our traditions that are worth still thinking about and preserving?
Well, if it was as bad as that, it would be very difficult, obviously, to be a conservative. I mean, you can only be a conservative where you have some conception of what you're going to conserve. But I think people have not lost that conception as much as the media want to say. In particular, I think there remains, especially in the Anglosphere, in Britain and America, this rooted idea that civil society is independent of the state and capable of producing its own institutions and its own loyalties without reference to the state. And I think that is something you see very strongly in America. Obviously, Tocqueville remarked on it 200 years ago, but it's still there. And with it, there's the respect for law and for legal solutions rather than imposed bureaucratic solutions to social conflict. So I think that in those respects, there is a core conservative sentiment throughout the Anglosphere, and even many people on the left share it, at least in Britain.
So to bring in another thinker here, Michael Oakeshott is one that you discuss at length in the book, particularly in the early chapters. And Oakeshott famously had a binary distinction between the Enterprise Association and then the Civil Association, the former having an express purpose, a goal for its organization, and the other was more of a habit of association, a habit of being, of the members being together, doing things together, but they weren't really going somewhere. Now, of course, we have a conception of statehood, and I think I'll just use shorthand. I think progressivism in America, say social democratic understanding in the UK, of a really rigorous form of equality, of egalitarianism, of a rights culture that isn't necessarily about reciprocity, but claims, grand claims that can only really be satisfied by incredible amounts of power in the state. These seems to be the threats, the major threats that you're describing to this notion of an independent civil society, because it too must be brought in conformity with these notions.
I totally agree with that. I'm not saying that the position that it's easy to be a conservative now, or that the way forward for a conservative is clearly marked. On the contrary, I totally agree that this massive transfer of powers to the state and the culture of entitlements that goes with it has made it very difficult to turn people's attention away from what they are owed, what they can get, etc., to what they themselves can do and the realm of their duties. And if you can't turn people in that direction, obviously you will never get civil society to start again. But I'm not as despairing about human beings as all that. And the good news is that the state is going to run out of money.
Yes.
And this whole philosophy of entitlements will collapse. Of course, what one fears is that it will collapse in chaos and recrimination. But it might not. It might do as it did in wartime in both Britain and America, produce a renewal of social commitment, communities which actually reach out to help each other instead of taking advantage of what is on offer for themselves.
I want to ask you, just maybe tying into this point, maybe on a more practical level. So I recently had another Englishman, David Conway, on this program discussing his book of, it was called With Friends Like These, and it's making the case for Britain to exit the European Union. That argument, it seems to me, is thicker and even more palpable than it's been in recent years, particularly with the victory of the United Kingdom Independence Party in local elections and also European parliamentary elections. What seems to be driving that, and I think this ties into your book, is the concern of lack of control over borders. Lack of control over borders, and particularly sort of endless amounts of immigration. And that's not to say that one is beating up on immigration. I mean, that's kind of the counterclaim. But it's to say that there is no sense of borders, of membership, and if that is gone, obligations and loyalties are harder to make sense of. You spend a lot of time in this book talking about borders and territory, which is it's interesting for me as an American conservative to grapple with that. I think what you're saying is very interesting and very true. I haven't thought along those lines enough. And so I wonder, maybe bring that out, because that seems to be driving, if it's perhaps not as articulate in public arguments, that seems to be driving what's happening right now in Britain, I think, with a rising push for an exit from the European Union. Now, there could be a referendum in 2017 if the Conservative Party is returned in 2015.
Yes, so this is the issue of the day in Britain. It is the explanation of all the changes that we've seen in the electoral patterns. And it's the reason why the Labour Party is not really making any progress, even though the Conservative Party is not doing that well. My view is what I express in the book, that actually all of politics depends upon a pre-political identity, on people's sense that they belong together, and we can't define that identity anymore in either racial or religious terms, we have to have some other way of defining it. And of course, we do have that other way because we have a territorial jurisdiction and a rule of law exerted over a certain territory with a kind of sacred attitude to borders, which is especially true in England, of course, because we're surrounded by the sea. And this has served people, as it were, in lieu of any kind of atavistic form of membership. It is their form of membership, an open membership based on neighborhood within secure borders which are defended as ours. And if you take those away, of course you're taking away the pre-political identity. And then people are extremely concerned, as you rightly say, that perhaps they're in this place with people to whom they owe nothing and from whom they can claim nothing.
You're arguing in the book that the nation state, I take it, is the essential condition of individual freedom. And
well, yes, it is now. The kind of freedoms that we have are based on a secular law, obviously, a law which does not impose a particular ideology or a particular religious outlook, and which leaves people free to create institutions of their own. And this, in the end, depends obviously upon something like the nation state, not necessarily in the form that we know it today, but certainly something in which the place and the rule of law that governs it is all important.
When we look at the European Union, the contrasts, I think, are immediately evident in what it thinks are the essential conditions of freedom, which are very different from, say, your argument of the nation state. Many would argue, though, and this would be before, I guess, the European Union was really settled itself and has kind of been set upon its current pattern or launched upon its current pattern of governance. Many looked to it as a unifying force within Europe that would guarantee free trade and peace throughout the continent. And now, of course, this seems to be the crucial question is political accountability, the democratic deficit, but something else. You hint at it in the book. It is not restoring vitality on the continent, on a continent which desperately needs it. Is it itself coming into a new crisis of legitimacy besides the criticisms we've currently hear frequently?
Yes, I think that it is, because although the democratic process is very important and one way of securing legitimacy, it itself depends upon a deeper kind of legitimacy, of the first-person plural kind, which what I've just been talking about.
Yeah.
The Europe, I think people don't understand this as well as they should about the European Union. That, of course, it lacks that democratic kind of legitimacy because there isn't a proper democratic process. It's all very distorted and partial. But there's a deeper lack of legitimacy because it is unable to create the kind of first-person plural that would make the democratic process intelligible. And there are many reasons for this, but one of the principal reasons is that it was set up in the wrong way. It was set up precisely as a way of abolishing traditional loyalties and traditional national identities, rather than a way of exploiting them, so to encourage free trade and free relations between the several nation states.
I really thought your discussion of subsidiarity, your brief discussion of subsidiarity in the European Union and how it has been basically reinterpreted and reapplied by the European Union itself, seemed to me to speak volumes about how they understand any sort of local attachment or local government, local relations. It's, we will give you subsidiarity if we deem it necessary, rather than the other way around. I thought that was interesting.
It was perfectly reasonable, as defined by the encyclical of Pope Pius XII. It is a perfectly coherent concept, but it's used as a term of newspeak, in order to replace truth by power, in the way that Orwell so rightly points out in 1984.
So something I wanted to discuss, and I just thought it was so interesting and provocative, and yet also containing its own truth, is these concepts. You talk about confession and forgiveness, of being at the heart of a liberal order. And so while you are stressing secular law is what we must be tied to, and we must subordinate religious affiliations and ethnic affiliations, I understand that and agree with you. But yet you talk about this Christian, the Christian practice and belief in forgiveness and confession as being incredibly important to the development of liberal democracy. Tie that into to your discussion of these the pre-political membership, because I thought that was interesting and also maybe somewhat discordant, if maybe I failed to understand, but I wanted to hear from you on that.
Well, I suppose my position is that you can't detach what we are now from the history of our civilization, and the very fact that we have all these really rather remarkable ways of dealing with social conflict, like the legal process, the democratic process, and so on. The fact that we have those things is not to be understood as some kind of a priori invention. These are the byproducts of a civilization which was founded on something else. It was founded on a sacramental vision of what brings people together. And the church has always exerted this control over people's lives to remind them of this. It doesn't do so anymore, of course, because we're in many ways in a post-Christian society. But the Catholic Church made penitence into a sacrament and made the whole business of confession, accepting guilt, atoning for your faults, and begging forgiveness, made that into the fundamental religious experience, more fundamental than any other. And that worked its way into the legal systems and the political systems of the European states. And you can certainly find it there in the law of tort, in English common law, and you can find it in everything until recently. So I think we should always remember that we're downstream from this great spiritual inheritance. We haven't perhaps got it in its direct form anymore, but nevertheless, it works its way into the other things that we do have. That's what I want to say, and I think we are seeing very, very strongly the contrast between that and, for instance, the systems of government which depend on Islamic law.
Yes, yeah, you note at length the way Islamic theology tends to swallow the state, or has no way of even recognizing a separate sphere for the state. There's the Ummah, there's the law of God, and even the law of God has ceased evolving, has ceased adapting, and so we confront that. Now that of course is an immediate challenge for the United Kingdom, given the large amount of Islamic immigrants in the country now. And you argue, and you make I think a good point, that these obligations of citizenship that we're talking about have not been rightfully accepted by these new immigrants. But there's another point, and I kept waiting for you to make it. The failure of the home society to vigorously press its own claims, that its own sort of weakness and its own traditions creates the space for this sort of antagonism. I think this is very clear in France, even as high-minded, as thick as French citizenship is, it seems evident there as well. Yeah.
Absolutely, that's true. And I do talk about this, not in that book, but in other books. In my book on modern culture, I write about the culture of repudiation that has come across the sort of world of learning and the world of institution building as a result of the alienation from the religious inheritance. Not able to inherit it, you turn against it. Repudiate it, and I think that weakens your ability to stand up to threats. You think, oh, perhaps they're right. Perhaps those people who are threatening us have the right to threaten us, and it's we who are wrong. And perhaps we should not make any particular effort to defend our institutions against what they demand. And I think that has been very much the case in Europe, certainly in Britain and Holland too. It's what
go ahead.
Ayaan Hirsi Ali took against in Holland. And she said, look, what do you people represent? I came here, hot foot from Somalia, where I was threatened with just about everything that you are free from in order to enjoy the freedoms that you have. And I'm willing to defend them, but you're not. That
Yes.
was her message. And as a result, of course, they all reacted against her, and she ended up here like everybody else.
And now she's can't even speak at Brandeis University, which is interesting.
Yes, yeah.
Recently
That
for
was
the
an
commencement address, yeah.
Extremely
So
interesting episode, yeah.
I want to kind of get into, you have a discussion of seeing man through the lens of just economics and reducing political order to economic order at times. And I take it, one way I was thinking about that, so if we have no unifying synthesis within a culture, and if the multiculturalists do sort of reign supreme and are able to intimidate people and prevent these older patterns from reasserting themselves, but of course, and you make this point, what are they offering? The first person plural they offer is really nothing but it's a negative. There's really nothing to unite around. So I keep thinking, well, okay, but we can't all agree on seemingly a lot of people, a kind of a utilitarian commitment to markets and to the goods and prosperity they bring about. But you write, and this is on page 20, I just want to read it and get a comment from you. The error of reducing political order to the operations of the market parallels the error of revolutionary socialism and reducing politics to a plan. Edmund Burke argued against the geometrical politics, as he called it, of the French revolutionaries that proposed a rational goal and a collective procedure for achieving it, and which mobilized the whole of society behind the resulting program. Burke looked to the association of the dead, the living, and the unborn. And you write at the end of that paragraph, we take the future of our community into account not by fictitious cost-benefit calculations, but more concretely by seeing ourselves as inheriting benefits and passing them on. I suppose that's another virtue of gratitude that's strangely missing these days.
Yes, I mean this is a core part of my thesis. That of course economics is important in politics, and economic reasoning is important, and you should always calculate the costs and the benefits of what you do. But there are some costs and benefits which are incalculable, and there are also things about which we do not calculate and should not calculate because they determine what we are. You don't. So things like love, sex, family, these are ring-fenced from market transactions. And when the market takes them over, as it has been doing, of course, in the case of sex, we are rightly repelled by this. We think that something sacred has been tampered with. And I think if we lose that feeling, we have no conception of the ends of life, and therefore no conception of why we're reasoning about the means at all.
You have in your book later on, you have a discussion of a family on a plot of land, aesthetically pleasing. The father has a skill; he can make more money. He could be an electrician. Said he chooses to teach physics at a local high school. His wife chooses to stay at home with their handicapped son. Their children are planning to, participate in a trade but not move far away. They certainly don't seem to be planning to do big things. And you note the economic way of thinking would be aghast at this. And then you draw a larger comparison with, say, the thinking of the European Union, the thinking of the way it thinks about economic order in the continent and its willingness to displace anything that stands in that sort of managerial capitalist mindset it has.
Yeah.
To make this point very clear, I thought that was worth thinking about at length, and in particular, just because it seems even in American conservatism there's a difficulty in talking about value apart from just market values. In particular, you mention even ringing off countryside from suburban to. I suppose that's more pressing of an issue in England, given just geography.
Yes.
In America, of course, that would be something wholly associated with the left, almost wholly associated with the left. So I just interesting arguments that you're making there. I wanted to discuss with you.
Right. Well, yes. as you say, the situation of America is very different from anywhere in Europe in that there's masses of land and there's masses of resources, and any attempt to ring fence things like that awakens the old American antagonism to the interfering person, the person who wants to stop me doing what it's my constitutional right to do. And this has badly affected planning in America. It's the reason why it's not just the reason for urban sprawl, but also the endless desecration of highways. You just go from you go through a continuous 1,000-mile stream of junk to get to your destination, and I think that actually it has negative effects on people's sense of their homeland and their love for it. America, just like everywhere else, it is ultimately dependent upon this idea of the beauty of the homeland. America the Beautiful is a constant theme, and it's all there in the art and in the literature. The literature, of all those Jack Kerouac types. It's there, that the wilderness is out there and it's ours, and we can visit it, but we don't want to spoil it. But you can only protect it if you actually ring fence it, and even then perhaps it's precarious, as we know from the history of the national parks. So, this is a huge issue, and it's one where, as you rightly say, that the left in America has had more to say than the right. All the people on the right tend to think of this as something which cannot be dealt with without interfering with fundamental property rights, and property rights must take precedence. But we in Britain have not seen it that way. I'm not saying that we've done everything perfectly, but it does mean that our cities are not just derelict downtowns like Detroit.
Yes. Interesting here, because I wanted to get into your discussion of, and your chapters. I like the way you frame them. The truth in environmentalism, the truth about capitalism. You even have the truth about socialism. Maybe we can discuss that in a minute. On the environmentalism, though, you make an interesting point, and I think this ties into what we're discussing. You reject the global international treaties. You reject even the idea, and I think rightfully so, that we could do anything globally about global warming. The only thing, to the extent global warming is a problem, and I think that's still an if global warming is a problem, the only thing we could really do is clean energy, and that's marketable, that has its own private utility in the market. You make that point, but then you note, and I think this is important to discuss. Environmentalism, to the extent it matters, should be something tied to the homeland, to a nation, asserting its own priorities, but that also one wants to give corporations a reason to internalize their externalities. And you note, and I've thought about this argument. I took you to be saying sort of the large scale capitalism of the West really could not happen, or it could happen, but it would look differently if what you were describing came to pass. Maybe the market would be more local. It would be something people see themselves in rather than something they experience abstractly.
Well, yes, I think I deal with this at length in my book on how to think seriously about the planet. Obviously, whatever system you have for whatever economic system you have, there are going to be externalities, and the larger the corporations involved, the more resources they'll devote to externalizing their costs, and that is so obvious from what we've seen, and there is no easy solution to this. But what one can say is that there are ways in which governments make it easy for corporations to externalize their costs. For instance, by providing infrastructure which favors one kind of corporation over another, or planning laws that favor one kind of industry over another, laws which favor centralized distribution over local markets. And we've seen that in particular in America and Europe, in the connection with the supermarkets, which have taken advantage of the infrastructure and the planning laws in order to externalize their costs and to impose impossible costs on their small-scale competitors.
Well,
yeah.
No, go ahead. I didn't interrupt you.
Yeah, that's just one example of what I think to be an environmentally catastrophic, not catastrophic, but very damaging development, which is the centralized food economy, dependent on packaging and all the rest, which has arisen to a great extent as a byproduct of regulations which have encouraged externalities. But I think we can't solve these problems just like that, but some knowledge of what they are and a sense of how one can relocalize things, I think is absolutely necessary if we are to get away from these totally futile environmental questions like how do we stop the planet getting warmer?
No, interesting. As I read your argument, though, I'm thinking of my own experience. I have 4 children. I live in the suburbs of a large Midwestern city. It's incredibly cheap to live here. My home is large enough for a family of 6. It's affordable. I can feed my family very cheaply at Costco, that's a giant. But even a large supermarket works as well. Gas is very cheap in America. I'm able to live well outside the downtown of Indianapolis, which has its problems, and so we're safe. It seems to me as I'm thinking about that, I'm thinking, yes, but these lower costs also facilitate family life. Some have noted, there's the dirt gap in American states, and that where it's actually cheaper to build and live in a home, you see more families and more families with children, which is, of course, the beginning of a home, the essential aspect of a home, and that's in American politics, that's really the basis of conservatism. To the extent it's going to hang on, it's going to be married families with children anchoring the thing. So I just kind of thought about that as you were saying these things about large supermarkets, et cetera.
Yeah, well, you're absolutely right that the state doesn't merely subsidize the large-scale distribution networks, supermarkets included. It also subsidized the ways of life, the forms of life that have grown from them. And those forms of life are often very family-friendly. The dependence on cheap food and ease of movement and so on. And you might be right. So that's where the next generation of conservative voters is being bred. It's very expensive in the circumstances in which we are to be environmentally conscious, and it is absolutely the case that if you live according to the principles that I feel ought to be acknowledged, then you'd have to accept that food should be a lot more expensive than it is, that people should live or have to live closer together, and all that sort of thing. How to solve this problem is not something that I go into in the book, though I do say some things about it in the bigger book. But it's not as though I'm the only person pointing this out. People like Howard Kunstler and so on, they write all the time about this, and we know that there are disadvantages whichever way you go, and the only solution is going to be a compromise in the end.
Yeah, no, I mean your point is well taken. A lot of conservatives or intellectual conservatives in America talk about the revolution of a piece of legislation called the National Highway Act, which largely facilitated the growth of suburbs and is an act of emancipation, really in American life, and one that I can see clearly with my own eyes. Maybe in a different vein, you say there is a certain truth in socialism. What is that truth? And also, in thinking about that, to the extent socialism poses a problem today, it's not in the pure theory of Marx. It's in something called resentment. And that's really where it generates its power from. So just interesting, provocative argument. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, yes, what I say is that if we acknowledge that there has to be a pre-political unity of some kind to make the political process possible, and then you have to have policies which include those members of society who couldn't from their own efforts, include themselves. And so they couldn't put themselves in a position of thinking that they are in a network of mutual benefits. If they think, if they are, as it were, getting nothing out of the system and are in a state of poverty or deprivation, then you're not. Then of course they're going to feel excluded from the whole social deal. So the truth in socialism is that since in a large society like ours, private charity is not going to solve the problem of those people. There has to be some initiative from above, some kind of state initiative, in order to generate the necessary procedure of inclusion. And that's so it's subordinate to the need for a first-person plural. But having said that, I don't want to say that class war is the truth in politics, or that one should give way in any way, in fact, to the egalitarian ideology that so often goes with all this. I give arguments against the idea of social justice, saying that it is actually an incoherent idea, and reject the revolutionary path of people like Marx. What I want to say is that having acknowledged this truth in socialism, one then must go on to recognize that if you harp on this truth all the time, make this into the fundamental principle from which all politics flows, which is what essentially our Labour Party does, then all you are doing is legitimizing resentment and putting the position of people who actually have something and have achievements of their own, making their position more or less indefensible.
The part of conservatism you suggest, or you argue, is what can we save now? What can we conserve now? And I take it that your point is we have to acknowledge the need for some sort of transfer payment system. It's impossible really to think that we wouldn't have a pretty sizable welfare state. I suppose, and this is something happening in America, as you know, but can we make it more efficient, more responsible? Can we make it, and could we design it in a way that actually inculcates not habits of dependence, like the poverty trap or the welfare trap, but actually could be just a base, but people, you're not going to stay there unless, old age or, injury or sickness or something like that. And I take it, though, the problem is this is all so immensely difficult. Once we begin dealing with these programs, it does seem that they inculcate these habits, and then of course they can be preyed upon. Most Americans think that there's an endless amount of wealth to pay for Medicare. They take usually a multiple of 3 or 4 of what they put in. It's largely an unsustainable situation that we're in. In Britain, I mean, my question is, going forward, thinking about these questions, who's articulating any sort of conservative response that would allow Britain as it is to be conserved? And if they are, is there any sort of notion that there has to be something more than just conservative, or something conserved, but something reclaimed? Something like, Ronald Reagan was very clear. He was going to reclaim founding principles. To the extent he succeeded is, debated. Obviously, he didn't succeed as much as he wanted to. But I think Thatcher had a notion of that, of a revanchist conservatism that she was after. And sometimes I sense in your book you don't have that sense. It does seem like you think it's an endless rearguard action that we're fighting.
Well, yes, I agree with that. I think life is an endless rearguard action from the moment of birth onwards. I don't think the myths that you can govern a community in light of the idea of progress is precisely one of the problems that we have to deal with. We are in the business. We've inherited something. We're in the business of hanging on to it. When it comes to the question that you raised about welfare and entitlements and all that, and there, as you rightly say, it gives rise to a culture of dependency and the belief that the funds available are unlimited, and politicians are voted into office in order to distribute those funds, even if they don't exist. And that's partly why all modern governments borrow endlessly from the future. And there are those who, like Krugman, who say that doesn't matter. But there are others like me who say that it certainly does matter, because eventually the future will strike back. And people will no longer be prepared to meet the debts that have been imposed upon them by their predecessors. So there is.
Yeah. Oh, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I'm sorry.
I'm just saying that therefore there is an inherent instability in the whole entitlements approach to politics, and it inevitably does erode institutions if people are constantly hungering for the resources to feed the budget. Then they will sacrifice institutions and assets one after another in order to produce the temporary interest on the loan.
Something that seems pernicious in our time, that maybe, thinking of Kenneth Minogue's book several decades ago, I think it appeared in the early 1970s, The Liberal Mind, and then the Servile Mind. It seems that these, we'll say, policies associated with the left or ideas associated with the left have really infected, they're not just in government, they're in the way we think about family, the way we think about religion, they're inside the church. I mean, obviously the Church of England, from what I see, is incredible left-wing tilt to it. And this comes almost from the top, it seems, down in the seminaries, I would imagine. It's in the military. It's in all of these sort of pre-liberal associations, which are, I think, a core part of your argument. And they're there. And I think the question is how does one even now find a space from which to reclaim human freedom and these forms of association that you claim are actually the essence of a free society properly understood. And so I think that's there. I think it's interesting. It seems to me in the book you end with, if there's a sign of hope, it would have to be in education. It would have to be in policies of reclaiming students from control of the state. Obviously in America, I think this is happening. It seems, no one really challenges homeschooling in a fundamentally legal way, the way they once did, and trying to stop it. And it's growing at 10 to 15% a year, I've read. We have vouchers, which no one is really opposing that. Charter schools, interesting as well. So it seems to me if that's hope, it seems to me that would be one place where it has to begin. You have to begin with the minds of your next generation and imparting to them a different way of thinking, of being a citizen.
Well, no, you're right. Those are the areas in which parents who have children they care for create the space which those children need in order to develop. And it has to be said, of course, that there are a lot of parents who have children they don't care for, or don't care for enough. And that is one of the problems. But as you say, that in America there's been quite a lot of movement in this, and in Britain too. And it's come very late, because it's really a matter of reclaiming education from the socialists, who don't actually believe in education because it makes distinctions between people, and distinctions is what they cannot tolerate. And I think this is really, in the end, a cultural matter. You have to rethink this and re-inject in some way into the public discourse the idea that discrimination is good, not bad. That you should always be discriminating between people, but not, of course, on irrelevant grounds. But there are always relevant grounds, and people should make judgments. People shouldn't be afraid of giving offence, and so on. And this is something that I was brought up to believe, that you went out and you made judgments, and if you gave offence, that wasn't your fault. That was the fault of the person who took offence. And maybe it has to be moderated by good manners and everything. But in America, manners are being remade completely, so that they are all about neither giving or taking offence, but being in a state of total passive acceptance of each other. Good manners are not really ways of they're not forms of friendly greeting. They're forms of exit from the embarrassment of the other, and that is something which I fear has taken over, and it needs to be confronted by satire, by the rudeness, if necessary, but also by presenting people with the fact that they have to accept that they are objects of judgment and don't live up to the best that could be expected of them.
Roger, thank you so much. I think on that note, we can come to an end. We've been discussing with Roger Scruton his latest book, How to Be a Conservative. Thank you so much for your time.
Well, thank you for inviting me. Thanks.
This is your host, Richard Grinch, and you have been listening to a podcast that can be found at libertylawsite.org, where you can subscribe, comment, and find other episodes and links related to today's conversation. Our email address is lal@libertyfund.org.